So we've got lots of clients that are having questions about masks and vaccines and COVID, and the legal environment at both the federal and state level has been pretty complicated. And I know this from having dealt with managing the firm and getting advice from both of you about how to deal with that. Thought it would help to have a conversation to get into some of the nuts and bolts of things that have happened here. So maybe the first place to start, Maureen, you could tell us a little bit about the executive order that was issued by the White House in September and how that has a bearing on all this.
Sure. So we're talking about Executive Order 14042, and it's called Ensuring Adequate COVID Safety Protocols for Federal Contractors. And what the executive order does basically is it requires all federal government contractors and subcontractors to comply with guidance issued by the Safer Federal Workforce Task Force. So then a couple weeks after the executive order came out, the task force issued guidance. And that guidance actually lays out specifically what these contractors need to do to comply with the executive order.
So what employers does that task force guidance apply to?
So there are a lot of definitions in the guidance. You have to go through multiple pages of definitions to really understand what applies here. And basically, a covered contractor is any prime or sub at any tier who is a party to a covered contract. And a covered contract is any prime contract or subcontract that has a clause requiring the employer or the contractor to comply with these vaccine and other guidelines. So basically, any new contracts that are awarded after February 14th have to include this clause. And then for existing contracts, they have to add the clause when they are up for either an option being exercised or an extension being made on the contract.
So what happens with contracts that are midway that aren't up for extension? Is that being discussed?
That's up for discussion. Some agencies, GSA, for example, has inserted the new requirements into existing contracts, but it seems to vary by depending on the agency.
Right. So there certainly are some contracts and some contractors who are not going to be covered by this right now, unless the agency they have a contract with actually makes some effort to go back and add the clause now, which they're not required to do.
So what about the employee side of it? Which employees does it apply to?
So it's a fairly wide range of employees. So basically, it can be a full-time employee or a part-time employee of a covered contractor, and there are three categories. So the first is an employee who's working on a covered contract. So that's pretty straightforward. If you are, directly billing to a contract, you're going to be covered. And that specifically includes remote employees, which is interesting. So if you have a remote employee who's working from home 100% of the time, never goes to your office, never goes to a government site, if they are working on a covered contract, they must be vaccinated. Then the second category is employees who are working in connection with the covered contract. So this is somebody who isn't directly billing on a contract, but whose work is necessary to the performance of the contract. So this is think of back office functions, HR, legal, billing, accounting. I think this could potentially cover, a large percentage of staff at a lot of government contractors. And then the third category is any employee who's working at a covered contractor workplace. And that is basically a location that's controlled by the contractor, where any employee who falls into either of those first two categories, so who's working on a covered contract or working in connection with a covered contract, is likely to be at that location during the period of performance. So even if you only have one employee in your entire floor or your entire building who's working on a covered contract, potentially all of the employees on that floor or at that site could be subject to the vaccination requirements also.
So once an employer decides that they're covered under these covered contract requirements, what does the guidance require of that employer?
So it basically requires them to ensure that all employees are vaccinated, subject to the exemptions that we're familiar with now, the disability-related exemptions or the religious exemptions.
And it's different in that you can't have a test out option. You actually have to get vaccinated.
Exactly. So whereas with private employers, there's an option of having a testing opt-out. For these federal contractor employees, they actually are required to be vaccinated. There is no testing option.
And the significant exemptions that we've talked about or that we're hearing about are religious exemptions and medical exemptions.
Right.
What about masking and distancing requirements? Are those covered in the EO and the task force guidance?
They are. So that is going to be a requirement at any federal government contractor work site. And these are kind of the guidelines that we are already familiar with through the CDC, through some state agencies also. If you're in a high transmission area, even vaccinated employees will need to wear masks in the office. If you're in a low to moderate transmission area, vaccinated employees do not need to wear masks in the office. Unvaccinated employees are going to be required to wear masks in any case. And then, of course, there are exceptions. For example, if you are in an office by yourself with the door closed, you can take your mask off then.
And the same with eating or drinking as well.
Same with eating and drinking. And the office has to have, one of the distinctions is the office has to be fully enclosed. It can't be sort of partitions that go partway up. So fully enclosed office by yourself. Eating or drinking as long as you maintain social distancing. So, and that's consistent with Virginia regulations now. So it shouldn't be much of a change for those of you who operate in Virginia.
Well, it feels like most people don't actually know that that's the requirement in Virginia because the Dolly regulations were issued somewhat under the cover of night.
It is a well-kept secret.
I've been watching those with bated breath because right now Fairfax is finally back to moderate transmission after having spent a couple of months at the higher levels, and Arlington is still in the orange but starting to drop down. So hopefully we'll be able to take our masks off here pretty soon as well.